Hello, good morning or evening, wherever you are around the world. Um, this is the Advanced Web Dev Workshop. We're super excited to see you guys and have you all here today. Claire and Akshaj are going to join a bit later. I'm just going to get us started for now. All right, let's dive right into it. So you guys are here because you want to learn how to create a website. And not just any website, you want to create a full stack front end, back end website. So what we're going to assume is that you already know HTML, you already know CSS, you already know JavaScript, and you know how to build like a static website that maybe you can host on GitHub pages or something like that. But what we're going to teach you is a bunch of advanced tools that you can use in your websites to make them even more appealing. So we're going to teach you React, which is a front-end library for making your website a lot more efficient and scalable. We're going to teach you the difference between front-end and back-end. So don't worry if you haven't heard of that before. Node.js, which is a back-end like environment, kind of. JS stands for JavaScript there. What APIs are, how to use them, how to make your own, and as well as databases in general, and specifically how to use MongoDB, which is the database we're going to be using later today. As for the agenda across all 4 workshops, this first workshop, what we're going to do is we're going to review HTML, CSS, JavaScript real quick, just to make sure everyone's caught up to the same page. Not sure how rusty you guys are, but we'll just do a quick review. And then for the rest of the workshop, we're going to be talking about React. So we're going to be doing an introduction to what exactly React is, and how it kind of looks, like a high-level overview. Workshop 2 is going to be spent thoroughly looking into React and doing a deep dive there. So fully understanding how this powerful front-end language works and makes our websites run more efficiently. Workshop 3, we're going to talk about backend. That's the backend workshop. We're going to talk about servers, APIs, databases, how all of that works together to form your website. And finally, in the last workshop, we're going to combine all of these together. You don't have to, but you can code along if you want. And we're going to be making a full web app from scratch called Acebook, which is kind of like a ripoff of Facebook. So that's the plan for today. If you have any questions about that or any questions along the way, we have this questions doc that you guys can ask questions on. So let me actually pull that up real quick to show you what it looks like. It looks something like this. So if you go to that tiny URL link, Akshaj and Claire are logged in to this questions doc now. So whenever you have a question like, what is JavaScript again? You can type it there, and then Akshaj and Claire will answer your question right away. So definitely make sure to use that. That's how we're going to be answering your questions offline. If you think you have a question that's relevant to everyone, definitely feel free to interrupt, unmute, just ask your question. We love that as well. Cool. Okay, let's get started. So the big picture, you want to build this website, right? And before, what we learned is probably websites are comprised of 3 things: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And the way I like to think of those 3 things are parts of a human body, right? So you look at this human. What has this human got? This human's got bones, right? The bones provide structure to the human's body. They kind of tell the human where everything else should be built up on top of it. So that's kind of like HTML, right? HTML provides this backbone for your website. And then humans, we have skin to cover up all of that nasty stuff that's going on inside. And that makes us look pretty, right? So skin, that's kind of like the CSS. It's the styling of the website. It's what makes everything fit together and look nice. And then you have the internal organs and the muscles of a human that allows us to do things, move around, breathe, etc., communicate. And that's kind of how we should think about JavaScript. JavaScript is what handles all of the logic. for the website. It handles all the functionality of the website and allows us to do the things we want to do. Going into each of those individually, just a little bit more in depth. So HTML does not stand for high-tech machine learning. It stands for hypertext markup language. So this is going to be the coding language your web browser uses to describe the content and structure of your web pages. So again, like the bones, right? The content and the structure, what goes where, how things fit together. And if we look at a website like Discord, this is Discord's website. What HTML basically does is it breaks up this website into boxes. That's really important. That's going to be a theme moving forward. So remember that HTML it's like the divs, right? So it's going to break it into boxes. So see those two red boxes there? That's how the website's separated up with HTML logic. And then these orange boxes here, maybe there's a little bit more separation between that top nav bar and like this top nav bar up here and this middle section over here. And then if we go one layer further, you know, there's more separation between this header, this body of text, etc. But the moral of the story is that HTML sort of organizes your website and puts the stuff where it needs to go. And then in your code, that would look something like this. So you have this big HTML box, and then there's further separation with these little tags. They can be divs, body, head, etc. Okay, moving on to CSS. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. These are the rules that will tell your web browser how things should look. So how should stuff look? Should it look this way? Should it look red? Should it look blue? Etc. And here's the SpongeBob meme I was alluding to, but if you just have a website that's plain HTML, you just got bones, right? And that's not very good looking. But if you add in a little bit of CSS, you get something that's recognizable. And I mean, Squidward's not the prettiest dude, but better than just bones. And if you add in a lot of CSS and you really put an effort there to style everything, you can make even the, I don't want to call them ugly because that's a little mean, but some less appealing things look more appealing. We'll put it that way. So CSS, it's like cosmetics, right? Making stuff look good, making your website do cool things. And the way we should think of it is like a list of descriptions for making our website look pretty. So let's look at how that would look. If we look at the Discord website, this is what it looks like with CSS, right? Let's see what happens when we remove all the CSS. This is what it looks like. So if Discord had no CSS, the website would actually look like this. And you can kind of see like, okay, we have the same content. We have this login button here. That's a login button here. You see your place to talk, but this is like very, very bare and not very appealing. This website's a lot nicer. You can even see like this blue image in the background. It's like very faint, but that would correspond to this. So again, driving home the point, CSS makes stuff look great. And the way we incorporated CSS before probably was we linked a style sheet. So that's going to be something that we're going to keep doing. We're going to have a style sheet, some style.css, or you can name it whatever you want. But that's going to be linked in, and it's going to make things look nice. And what that style sheet looks like is, again, it's a list of descriptions, right? So we can have the names of certain divs, like different tags in HTML or different IDs or classes. And we can have descriptions for how they should look. So we can set the colors, we can set borders, we can set margins, we can set heights, we can set display styles, we can align things in certain ways, we can make them appear on the left, on the right, etc. So all of that stuff of rendering your website, making things go where they need to go, that's CSS's responsibility. And the last, but definitely not the least of these three languages is JavaScript. So JavaScript, remember that is the language that powers your website, right? It describes all the logic, all the functionality. Whenever you make a website, your website's killer feature is powered by JavaScript. And again, like we can see, when you have websites that are doing things, what is actually governing what's going on, all that logic, that's what's written in JavaScript. It's kind of like other programming languages in that sense. And the way you would use JavaScript in your normal websites is you would use the script tag. So you would use a script and then source src equals the name of your JavaScript file. And inside your JavaScript file, you would have a lot of code that describes what's going on, like describing various states of your website, various functions that need to run when buttons are clicked, etc. So that's kind of what's going on with JavaScript. And all of this stuff together, it works. It works. We can make decent websites. Like if you wanted to make Flappy Bird, you could make it using these tools. But the question is, can we do better? Can we make more interesting, more compelling websites? And the answer is yes, we can. So that's what this whole advanced workshop is about. And I guess I have a little bit more time to finish off this intro. So let's talk about our current framework versus what we're going to hopefully have by the end of these 4 workshops. So currently we have your web app, and that web app is just HTML. And there's kind of CSS and JavaScript that support the HTML, move stuff around, make things change dynamically. That's how websites work right now. And our proposed framework is that our web app is going to have something called the front end, as well as something called the back end. And we'll go over what that means more in depth later. But for now, front end, just think of that as what whoever's using your website is seeing. Back end is like a set of rules that are going on somewhere else that your front end can like talk to, but doesn't really know about otherwise. So front end is what I see as a user. Our front end is going to be driven by React, which again is that powerful front end JavaScript library that I mentioned earlier. So our React is going to drive our front end. Our back end, which is going to be like a server. Again, we'll explain what all of this means later, so don't worry if that's confusing. That'll be workshop 3. Our backend is going to be driven by Node.js, and the database it's referencing is going to be driven by MongoDB. So with this framework, we're going to be able to do a lot more things that maybe we weren't able to do previously. For example, live chat, or another example, storing pictures, like profile pictures in a database, right? So that's what's going on. And with that, I will turn it over to Akshaj and Claire to talk about React.
Thank you, Dan, for the great intro. I'm Akshaj, everyone. Claire is here as well. So I'll come from the questions off to here. Let me share screen real quick. Can you guys hear me okay? Nice. So let's get excited about React, which is our new way of coding websites, specifically the front end. So what is React? It's basically a JavaScript library that we use to build the front end of our websites. And it's cool because it's JavaScript, but we can do HTML within the JavaScript. So we can like programmatically write web pages, which is kind of cool. So you might be asking, why React? Why are we learning React? I've never heard of this. What's the point? And the reason is because it makes it really easy to make huge web pages. For example, Facebook uses React. That's really cool. Like Facebook, that's such a big site. They use React. Airbnb actually also uses React. So these 2 huge companies use React. So does Instagram. So does Discord. So does the New York Times, Code Academy, Instacart, all of these companies use React. Isn't that crazy? Basically every single huge company. So yeah, why do all of these companies use React? Because one, it's fast. Two, it allows for readable code. And probably the most important is you can write code in a way such that you focus on individual parts of the web page, and you can use them as building blocks to create the whole web page. And this makes it really easy to make huge websites where you might have like things repeating in certain areas. You can basically write things in building blocks and then combine the building blocks to make a whole web page. So what are React components? If you guys remember in HTML, Dan showed the little diagram where like there's different boxes which correspond to like different sections on the page. You can like have a div that represents kind of like a box, certain section on the page. In React, we call this components. So let's talk about some components. A React component is what lets you break down your whole web page into more manageable, smaller chunks of code. So for example, let's say you wanted to code the Facebook nav bar, and this is the Facebook nav bar. If you wanted to code that in HTML, that sounds like a very daunting task, right? Like there's so many things going on. But what React lets us do is we have this whole nav bar, which is a component, but we can actually divide it into child components. So how that would work is we have our full component, and then we divide it into little child components right here. So these are the different subcomponents of the navbar. You can see how we divide it into more manageable sections. And then we can go even further. And these child components can have their own child components. So yeah, as you can see, this one component can be divided into 5 smaller components, and those make them easier to code. So now when we focus on writing just this one piece of code, we can just write like a home button. And then in this component, we can just refer to the home button and we don't have to rewrite. I'll actually turn it over to Claire at this point, if Claire is here.
Hello. Yeah. Okay, give me a second to share screen. Can you guys see it? Akshaj,
Yep.
is it?
Yep.
Okay, so now that we know about components, we're going to talk about putting them together in something called a component tree. So essentially, a component tree is just a conceptual way of organizing your components logically so that bigger components become like the so-called parents of the smaller components. So let's look at a quick example. So here's the component breakdown we were looking at, and on the left is like one possible example of an appropriate component tree. So note that there's not really like one correct answer per se to making a component tree for your website. There's like probably multiple different answers, but there are definitely some that generally make more sense and some that make less sense. And if you make a component tree that makes like no sense whatsoever, you might find along the line that coding it will become really difficult and unintuitive. So yeah, so here on the top left, we have the leftmost topmost component that basically like includes everything in our site, and it's called app here. And then app represents our web application, so it should contain basically everything nested within it. And next, one indent line in, here we have navbar and feed and sidebar. And we can see that these are the big red boxes here. Basically, they represent like the big sections of our website that users see immediately on the page. And then we can break down feed even further. Like before, we can break it down into posts. And then we can break each post down into story, which here story just represents like the content of the post, like ignoring like the comments or likes or anything. So we can break down posts into story and comment. And there are probably other breakdowns you can do, but this is just like a very bare bones like breakdown of an Instagram website. So here's another question. So why do we want to use a component tree at all? Like, why do we have to think about our files nested in this parent-child way? Like, why can't we just make files however we want and like not have to think about it? Well, one of the most useful things about React is that we are able to store and pass information. And this can only happen if we have a preconceived notion of which direction the information should pass. So in a real life context, like if you think about like a hierarchical society, like parents would pass information down to their children, so their children would like know what's going on and stuff. So this idea is actually replicated in our componentry organization. So app is like the parent of all of our components, and it will be able to pass information down to navbar, feed, and sidebar. And then in turn, feed will also be able to pass down its information to posts, and then post to story and comment. And basically they can pass either their own information or information that they got from their own parents, either way. So this is the power of the component tree. So how do we actually handle this information that we're trying to pass? We're going to talk about two main types of information that we're going to handle in React, props and state. So one of the most important concepts in React is props. And props are basically input information that are passed from a parent to a child component. So here is our component tree again from before. And apps here can pass down props to navbar, feed, sidebar, etc. But actually, this is a one-way relationship. So parents can pass information down to children, but children cannot pass information back up to the parents. So this is a very key concept of props. Please remember, you cannot pass information up from children to parent. Another thing is that props are immutable, so they're read-only. So once you pass them down, like the child cannot change it. And if you think about it, this makes sense because remember, children cannot pass information back up. So even if it theoretically like changed the value of the prop, like no one else would know about it anyways. So basically, we just think of props as read-only. Okay, so now you may be wondering, like we've been talking about props, like passing props, but what exactly are props? Like what information can they hold? Props can basically be anything you want. So you can pass down entire JavaScript objects. You can pass down Boolean variables and like stuff like maybe you want to pass down like whether a user is logged into your site and you want to pass it down from app, down to feed, down to post, down to story. That would be a way to do it. And other examples are things like IDs or just simple text, numbers. You can even pass down entire functions or entire components as a prop. So that's basically a high-level overview of what props are. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about state. So the other type of big information that we can handle in React is state. And state is private information that is maintained inside a component. So for state, you're not trying to pass it anywhere. Like for props, remember we're passing it down the component tree. For states, they're maintained within the component itself. So again, these are private, and other components cannot access the states of, so components cannot access the states of other components. And state is really useful if you want content on a page to change based on user input. So for example, this on the right, for example, I have checkboxes and I want to update the view. So if I click on this box, I want it to turn blue with the white check mark, then I could have like, don't worry about the syntax for now, but basically think of it as like, I have 3 fields in state, each of them representing each of these checkboxes. And when I click one, I want to set check 2 to, like if I click the second one, I want to set check 2 to true. If I click the third one, I want to set check 3 to true. And when I update state, React knows that the state has been updated and it will re-render the page. So that's the power of state. And React components have initial states. So for this example, all the boxes, you might want to set them to originally be initialized to false, like checked equals false, and then you can build functions or write code to update the state of the component and change what it looks like on your web browser. So yeah, so now we've gone over props and states. Let's tie it all back together into one simple statement that you must remember when you're making a website. So we want to make states stay, we want to make props pass. And the way props pass, again, is downwards. They pass from parent to child, and you cannot pass props upward. So on the component tree, if you structure like your post above your feed in your component tree, this will make prop passing like really difficult and probably like just not make sense overall. So a quick recap. React components let you break down chunks of your UI into reusable and independent pieces of code. And the component can be represented as a piece of HTML code or React components or both. And they can receive and maintain its own information, and React uses a component tree structure to pass information down throughout the component tree, and each component can take in props, which are basically inputs, and manages its own contained information through something called state. So props and state is like a pretty key concept of React, but like basically the first time I learned it, it was pretty confusing. So if you're confused right now, that's totally okay. We're gonna go through an analogy of component tree and passing props and everything using a shopping mall. So the things that a shopping mall has, it's like biggest components I can think of, probably like stores and restaurants. Like if you go in, you probably expect to see stores, and you probably expect to see a lot of restaurants. So we're just going to break it down into stores and restaurants for now. And then basic components that each of store and restaurant have. So stores have cashiers, they have sales staff, and most of all, they have merchandise. And then restaurants, they have chefs, they have waiters and waitresses, and they also have like ingredients to make food. And obviously there are other things, we're just going to keep it simple for now, so 3 for each. So imagine like in our like boxy like component format, the shopping mall is like this huge box that contains everything, right? And we have stores inside, which contain salespeople, cashiers, merchandise. And we also have restaurants that contain waiters, waitresses, and chefs and food items. And remember that these components are like, they're independent, so you can replicate them as many times as you want, which makes it useful to create like store components and restaurant components, because you can just like copy paste into your theoretical box. So now that we have our visualization of our shopping mall in box form, let's make a component tree. So on the top, like before we had app, now we have our overall thing called shopping mall, overall component called shopping mall. And under shopping mall, we have store and restaurant. And within store, we have cashier, salesperson, and item. I just changed it to item. And then merchandise to item. And then restaurant, we have chef, we have wait staff, we have ingredient. So this is a general breakdown of our component tree. A little bit more detail. So now that we know about parents and children components, shopping mall is the parent of store and restaurant. Store is a child of shopping mall, and it's a parent of cashier, salesperson, and item. And cashier, salesperson, item are all children of store. And then restaurant is also a child of shopping mall and a parent of chef, waitstaff, and ingredient. And then these 3 are also children of restaurant. So now bring it back to states and props. Remember that we want states to state and props to pass downwards to children. So let's look at shopping mall for now, basically the parent of everything in our app, and let's look at what state it might want to hold and what kind of props it might want to pass down. So to think about state, we want to think about what kinds of details about the shopping mall itself that we want to remember. So this is basically how we think about like what things we want to store in the state. So does anyone have any ideas of like things they might want to store in the state? Feel free to drop in the chat. It's okay if you don't know them. Yeah, location's a good one. Name of store, opening and closing hours. Yeah, those are all good ideas. Yeah, so basically we obviously want to know the name of the mall. Like we want to store that as information. And we want to know the address, location, someone said that. We want to know like what kinds of stores are inside. So we might want to store like an array of stores. We also want to know like what kinds of restaurants are inside. Like a list of restaurants might be nice to know. And then operating hours of the mall. So those are also important things that we should want to know about the mall. And there are also probably other ones you might want to know. These are just like some basic ones that we set up for now. So now, what are some things about the mall that we would want the children of the shopping mall, which remember is store and restaurant, to know? Feel free to drop your ideas in the chat. So these are things you might want to pass down as props. Yeah, so a lot of people are saying opening hours, which is pretty important because like you don't want the store. Oh yeah, these can also be included in the state above, but they don't have to be. Like they can be like information you're calculating within the component. So we want to know the name of the mall because the store wants to know what mall they're in. The store wants to know where it's located, obviously. So we want to know the address. And operating hours is pretty important because if the mall's closed, like stores can't be open. So that's a pretty important thing that we might need to like calculate operating hours later down in our component tree. And yeah, things like number of employees are also important. I didn't list them here, but obviously there are many right answers. So now we finished looking at shopping mall. Let's just go over another quick example for store. So now store has shopping mall didn't have any parents. It only had children. So now store has a parent, which is shopping mall, and it also has children. So let's look at what we want to store in the state. So we already received props passed down from its parent shopping mall. Recall that these are the name of the mall, operating hours of the mall, and the address of the mall. And so we don't need these details stored in the state because we already have them passed down as inputs, as props. So some other things we might want for state, like before we want to know the name of the store, operating hours of the store, like the store itself, not just the mall. And we want to probably know like the type of the store, like clothing, cosmetics, jewelry. By the way, these are like just like pretty general breakdowns. Like you don't like these might not be like the things you want to store. You might want to store more things or less things. That's totally fine. This is just like an example of things like the intuition behind like how you think of state and props. And like lists of staff might also be important. Items. And then what are some things about the store that we would like the children of the store to know about, like aka props? So some of these might be like the name of the store that the employees are working in, the operating hours, so like when do these employees have to work, and things like that. Okay, so final example, we're looking at basically the bottom like leaf node now of the component tree. So this chef component, it doesn't have children, but it has parent. So details about the chef that we want to remember, we already have props passed down from its parent. Assume that, like, I know previously we were talking about store, but assume that we have props passed down, such as like the restaurant name, the cuisine, and the operating hours. So maybe things that the chef wants to know additionally is like the chef's name, like the chef's salary, and maybe like years of working experience of the chef, and the days that they're on shift. And chef has no children. That's at the bottom of the component tree. So basically, we don't have to think about what props it's passing because there's nothing below it. So yeah, again, final review. We want to make state stay and want to make props pass downwards to the children. So now this is the high-level overview of how to think about states and props. And now Akshaj is going to talk about how to actually write these in code.
Okay, thank you, Claire. Let me share screen real quick. Okay, perfect. So we covered states and we covered props. Those are the two big things, I guess. But I know you guys really want to dive into the code because we like coding. So let's talk about how do you actually write a React component? So before we dive into that, I think that it's very important to like understand React, the states, the props, and everything. And it's definitely, since it's the first time you guys are hearing about this, it's probably hard to remember. So we created a little React guide at this link. I don't know if someone wants to drop it in the chat so that people can access it. But yeah, if you go to that, you'll have a little summary, and it includes stuff that from workshops 2 and 3 as well. So the parts that don't look familiar is just parts you haven't covered yet. So, okay, let's dive straight into code. So why is React so cool? It's because it's JavaScript. So it's literally JavaScript code, but we can put HTML inside of the JavaScript. That's kind of a neat concept, I think. a language within a language is nice. So, okay, let's go on a little thought experiment. We have HTML, and it's very cool. We can do like H1, it's a header. We can do like P, a paragraph. We can do a button, like the tag button. But what if we wanted to write our own tags? So the reason that would be nice is like in JavaScript or in like any language, you can write our own functions. And then we can like organize our code well because we write our own functions. What if we could write our own tags? That could be like our way of doing functions kind of in HTML. So as an example, Instagram is a big website. Let's say we're writing Instagram, and Instagram does use React, so they have to do this at some point. Imagine they wanted to write a comment component because they want comments on their website and they have to divide their whole website into components. So let's say they wanted to write a comment component and they wanted it to look something like this, just a nice stylized box with some border and background color and a little heart that can be clicked. And when you click it, it's liked. And when you click it again, it's unliked. And then it has some text, hi. So it would be really nice if you could just, in your HTML code, write the comment tag, and you can pass in this variable content equals hi, and then it would just display this. That would be very nice, in my opinion. So that's actually what React lets us do. Yeah, so a thing to remember is that components, to use the component in your code, it just looks like an HTML tag. And you can pass in some parameters. And those are called props, which is what Claire just talked about. This is how you pass in a prop. And you've seen this, like you can do a button tag and you can put an on click equals some function. That's really just a prop. It's just one of the parameters in your HTML. So, okay, here's our little Instagram page. We got our whole component right here. I don't remember if we mentioned it or not, but the whole component is called app. So for all of your websites, your whole website will lie in one component, which is called app. And that component will be divided into little subcomponents. As you can see, we have this nav bar, which is one component, this like main page type thing, this little sidebar. And then the nav bar itself is divided into more components. I assume this huge component right here is divided into like the post and then the comment section, and the comment section might be divided into comments. So yeah, let's write this comment. And yeah, so we want this comment HTML tag to turn into this display. Okay, so here's our first look at what the code of one component looks like. So you guys should stare at this for a while. It's a lot of unfamiliar things probably, but the only two parts that are important here are, okay, one, the name of the component is called comment. So we write class comment, extends component because it extends, it is a component. And we have these two functions right here, constructor and render. I'll say that again, constructor and render. Those are the two important parts of a component. So let's talk about the constructor. The constructor happens at the very beginning. So it's the first thing that happens when the component's on the web page. So usually what we use a constructor for is to initialize the state. So the state is the information, the data of like the private information of the component. It's like the state. I don't know how else to put it into words, but so we initialize it in the constructor because we want to initialize it once. So for example, we have our little comment, and one thing that could be put in the state is whether or not it's liked, because that's like a thing that's unique to the comment that we would want to store. It can change. It's like the information of the comment is whether it's liked or not. We might also want to put the content of the comment, but remember that was a prop. We passed that in, so we don't need to put that in the state. But yeah, this is how you initialize the state. You just do this.state equals, and then it's a little JavaScript object, and the isLiked parameter is false because we don't want it liked initially. And that's it. We just write the constructor. Very simple. It's just what happens at the beginning. And now let's move on to render. Render is what is actually displayed on the page. And what it essentially is it's a function that uses the props and the state, which are the two kind of inputs. Props are the input, and then state is like the information of the component. So it uses both of those, and it returns HTML code. That's really cool, because we return HTML code inside of JavaScript. So what that actually looks like is, here's the render function. We can do some JavaScript stuff before the return. We don't need to immediately return, but eventually we'll return, in parentheses, HTML code. So you guys know divs. We just have a div. You guys know that we can do class in HTML to specify CSS style. In React, class is actually called class name. It's the exact same thing. We just use class name instead of class. So this is what will style our component. And then these little brackets right here are how we put JavaScript inside of the HTML. So we want to access the content prop that we passed in, the text, inside of our HTML. And the way we do that is this.props dot the name of the prop. As you remember, the name of the prop is content. So this will just display hello on the page. And we can do whatever we want with this. We could like put a little h1 tag around it if we wanted it to be a header. And then if we want to display whether it's liked or not, we can just do the word liked, colon, and then this little bracket right here. This is how we access state. This dot state dot the name of the parameter of the state. And this will be either true or false, depending on whether we initialize it to true or false. So yeah, that's it. That's how you write a React component. You just have constructor and the render. I'll do a little thought experiment. We obviously would not like Instagram if it said the word liked, colon true, whenever a comment was liked. We want it to be an image probably, or some sort of heart, or something that looks good. So let's see how to do that. Oh yeah, I'm gonna pub that React guide again if you guys want to see it. This is all the code together, by the way. I think it cut out some parts at the top, but this is the constructor. This is the render. And I edited the code a little, and this is how you have an actual liked button instead of the liked colon. And the way we do it is we have our constructor, nothing changed. And then in our render, we can just do regular old JavaScript. So we're gonna let button, a variable, be undefined. And then if this.state.isLiked is true, we'll return the version of the button that is clicked, which can be a component. We could even use an image tag here and just return like a shaded in like button. Doesn't have to be a component. Literally, we can just put an image tag, any HTML. Else, we can have it be the unshaded and liked button, or the unliked button, or an image tag. And then we can just put in button in the HTML code. It's just like using JavaScript to render the HTML, basically. That's the whole power of React. And that's it. That's how you put a like button in the component. So we also want it to be that when you click the like button, it likes it. And when you click it again, it unlikes the component, unlikes the like button. That would be a nice feature to like or unlike the comment. So that's also pretty simple. All you do is, remember the old code is this. I literally just changed one line in this, I think I put a div around the button. Yeah, so there's just a div around the button, and it just has an on-click parameter. And the on-click will equal just a regular old JavaScript function goes into the brackets. And the function will just be a function that when it's run, it just toggles this.state.isLiked. And when we code that function and put it in there, then our like button is now clickable. And See, that's the power of state, because now the render just reads the state to figure out whether or not to display the button shaded in or not for liked or unliked. And then we can just change the state whenever we need to. And render will automatically re-render whenever the state changes. So everything will be good, we'll be happy. Yeah, so let's talk about how to actually write this function, by the way. That might be important. Also, like, feel free to ask any questions in the question doc. This is obviously a lot of code, so I hope. Also, check out the React guide if you need it. Ask in the chat. Someone will drop the link. Yeah, so let's condense the code a little bit. I did two things here. The left is what we just had previously. The right is like a slightly condensed version. First thing is I wrote the function. So if you look in the onClick, I have the function inside of the onClick, inside of the blue braces. All the function does is it sets the state to be the opposite of what the state originally was. And the way you set state is you do this dot set state, and then inside of the brackets, you put in, like inside of set state, you put in an object that has the keys as the things you want to change, and then the values are what you want to change them to, and it will just change the state. The other thing I changed was we had this clunky if statement right here, and I condensed it into one single line. If you guys have heard of the question mark colon notation, it's just a way of writing an if statement in one line. Basically, it returns this thing if, or sorry, this is always a Boolean, the first thing. And if the Boolean is true, it will display the first thing after the question mark. And if the Boolean is false, it will display the thing after the colon. So it's just a nicer way of writing all of this. Yeah, so let's talk about why we use this dot set state. Normally you'd be like, Akshaj, what are you doing? Why don't you just do this dot state dot is liked equals true to set the state? Why do you have to use this set state method when you can just use an equal sign? And yeah, you have a very good point. Usually for variables, you can just set them by just using an equal sign, and it's very nice. But you cannot do that for state. And the reason is because states aren't just regular old variables. First of all, like, it's not even in this function. It's in the constructor right now, and it needs to be throughout the whole app. So you need a special way of setting it. So that's why we use this dot set state. Claire will talk about that more in the next workshop. And also a little brief note, I want to talk about this function. You might be like, what is this parentheses arrow thing? I thought functions were just like this. You just put the name, the parameters, and then a little bracket. And you're right, this is how functions usually are, but we're going to use mostly in this series of workshops arrow notation, which is another way of writing functions. And it's basically the exact same thing, but it's just, it looks cooler, and also it makes things a little easier in React. So we're going to recommend that you use arrow notations whenever possible. The only places where you can't use arrow notation are render and constructor. These functions, they have to be like this. But otherwise, feel free to use arrow notation wherever you want. As a quick warm up, oh, I wasn't supposed to show you the answer. Well, that's okay. This is how you write arrow notation for this function, for where there are no inputs. You just do returns 5 equals parentheses arrow return 5. Very good. Arrow notation is great. But yeah, feel free to stare at this a little while longer to internalize it. Definitely, it's wild to see HTML in JavaScript. So it might take a while to like convince yourself that that's normal and that's a thing that we can do. Okay, so let's try to expand this a little and get our common component to show the author and the date, because Instagram comments normally don't just have the text, they also show you the author. And I actually don't even use Instagram that much, so I don't even know if they show the date. They probably should. I don't know, maybe they don't. But we're gonna make ours even better, and we're gonna show the date. So Yeah, so these are things we can pass in as props because they're inputs. It's kind of like in a function, if you wanted to return something, you would pass in the inputs to the function. Similarly, we want to be able to use this comment component wherever we want to use a comment. So obviously the author and the date and the content will be different per each comment. So we're going to want to pass them in as props so that we can easily just drop in this and get our handy dandy comment as a result of just writing this. So let's see how that looks. Actually, let's do a quick quiz in the chat. Anyone have an idea of like how you would add these in? Like, I don't know, any ideas? How would you access the props in the code? Obviously it is, yes, you would access them as props, exactly. And does anyone remember the syntax at all? Yes, oh my God, I'm so happy that people remembered. I did not expect anyone to remember because I literally like spent like 2 seconds on that slide, but it's great that you guys did. So yeah, you just add in a dis.props.author and a dis.props.date in the HTML code, just like you're writing normal HTML, but you're just using a variable instead of text. And obviously this will look really ugly on the page because there's no styling around the author. But if you want it to look nice, you guys know CSS and HTML, you can just put it in a div and like, I don't know, use your CSS tricks and everything to make it look all handy dandy nice. But yeah, you just put them in these curly braces, and that's how you put your JavaScript inside of the HTML. So thank you everyone for coming to the first workshop. Just a little recap for everything that we did so far. Why do we use React? Because it's easy to make large apps because you can just write components. You have your whole website. I'm gonna go back to that slide, by the way. So yeah, so like you have your whole website, and if someone told you, code Instagram for me, please, you'd be like, there's just so much, you know? But what you could do is you could first take your whole website. This is one component, and you can divide it into the nav bar, the body. You can divide the nav bar into this picture, the search bar, this like section, which is divided further. And then you can just divide, like you can get like 100 people and then assign one component to each person. And then everyone can code up their own component and you can put it all together. That's so much more manageable and it's a lot easier. So that's why we use React. Let me go back to the recap. Yeah, so the components are just the building blocks of your website. And the way we organize them is you have your whole site as one component. Each of them has like children. Each of the children might have their own children, et cetera, et cetera. And then we got our two big input type things. The props are the inputs to the component. So we have our component and we want to be able to use it, but obviously we don't want it to be the exact same everywhere. We want to be able to pass in some inputs and we want it to render based off of the input. So those are the inputs to the component, the props. I don't know if we mentioned this, but they're kind of read only in the sense that you don't modify the props inside of the component because it's kind of like in a JavaScript function where if you have like an add function, add A and B, you don't want to like modify A and B inside of the function. I know it's like you can sometimes, but it's weird. So in React, you can't do that. And then we have state, which is the internal information data about the component. For example, a comment can be liked or not, and we want to render differently based off of whether it's liked or not. But we don't really want that to be a prop. Like we don't know beforehand whether it's going to be liked or not. That's just something that changes over time. So that's more appropriate for a state. That's like the state of the component. Right now it is liked. And when they click something, we may change the state to make it unliked. So yeah, that's props and states. I think this is a ton of info we just threw at you. we just like basically explained React, which is a huge framework, and it's how you make all these like insanely complicated websites. So it makes sense if you guys are completely lost, no idea what's going on, completely okay. Just look over the React guide. And the React guide does include some stuff that will look unfamiliar. So just ignore the unfamiliar stuff. And yeah, we do have 30 extra minutes. So I think we can, obviously you can leave early if you want, but we expect probably most of you to be very confused. So we'll be answering questions in the questions doc. Feel free to probably jump in the chat too, or however you guys want.